Last week in the Torah, Parsha, we're halfway through, we're 3/4 of the way through the book of Exodus, and we come to the section, the last, it's 5, but actually 4 Parshiot in Exodus, where we're creating the shrine. Truma, Tetzaveh, and then Vayakel Pekude. And the line, which is in the book of Exodus 25:8, Asuli Mikdash, V'shachanti b'tocham. Make for me a holy place, and I, God, will dwell there among you. Radical idea that human beings make a place for God in the world. On one level, it's a crazy idea, and then the other level, it's really the birth of organized religion. Because what organized religion is, or is disorganized, organized religion is to create an institutional structure that's going to contain and express and teach and transmit spiritual life, spiritual discipline. This is the first one in the Bible. And what I suggested last week is the following 3 ideas. Number one is that in the way that the Bible sees it, the impulse to worship is natural. It's part of all of us. It's not just natural, it's just assumed. Right? Cain builds an altar, right? Noah builds an altar, which is to say that in each of us there is a natural impulse to raise our voices. And we always use vertical metaphors for some reason. To raise our voices and share our worship with that which is bigger than us. I want to attach myself to that which is the source of my being, attach myself to the real in the world, attach myself to the transcendent. I want to attach myself and I want to commune with the transcendent, with that which is above and beyond me, which is the source of my being. And I want to express my deepest needs, my deepest impulses to the transcendent. When I am filled with gratitude for the gifts of life, I want to say thank you. When I am broken because someone close to me is in pain, I want to pray for healing. When I am filled with guilt over having broken the expectations, having failed the expectations I have for myself or that others have for me, I'm filled with guilt and I want to expiate that guilt. These are these deep, deep human feelings. And we raise our voices, we raise our eyes. There's this sort of sense I want to worship, and it comes from deep within. Now, the Bible has 2 different ways to express those impulses. Prayer, verbal prayer, is spontaneous and personal. Miriam, who's Moses' sister, is sick with leprosy, which is ferociously frightening. And he prays to God this wonderful prayer of single syllables, Ana elna rifana la. Dear God, heal her. Just heal her. And I imagine every one of us has said that prayer at some point. Someone you love, you care for, is suffering. Just bring healing. And sometimes, it's interesting what that prayer really is. We want healing, but I think what we want more than that is a sort of echo that the pain we're feeling, the helplessness we're feeling is heard on high. That there's some echo in the universe of my experience of helplessness and of pain and of vulnerability. That there's an echo that I'm not alone. That I'm not shouting into the darkness. That there's something of real that acknowledges my pain. Ana elna rifana la. Here is the woman who raised him and cared for him and protected him when he was a baby and has stood by his side through the ordeals of this journey, and she's sick and he is beside himself. And Moses, who can be articulate when he needs to be, Ana elna rifana la, just spits out these syllables, right? And that's spontaneous prayer. Spontaneous, personal, emotional prayer is hear my plight. Just hear me. Just know that all I want to know is you hear me. That's all I want. You don't even have to fix it. Just know that I want to know that I'm heard. Right? I want to know that I'm heard. That's prayer. That's the first way of expressing the impulse to worship. The other way is that we have a class of people called priests, and they create an institutional structure for expressing individual and communal worship, and that's through sacrifice. And as completely contrasted with the prayer tradition, which is completely spontaneous and completely personal, sacrifice, I suggested last week, is highly articulated. It's rule-bound. There is a way to do it right. And you're given no latitude. There's no wiggle room in doing it. It has to be done properly. And so as opposed to prayer, which is just this burst of spontaneity, the sacrificial worship has carefully drawn structures. So it has a different sense. You take all of this explosion, the volcanic explosion of human emotions, human impulses, gratitude and wonder and guilt and expiation and fear and need, all of the mishmash of human emotions, and you put them in very, very strong bottles, carefully constructed bottles of ritual form. Right? You take everything that's all this mishmash of human emotion and you put it into this bottle of ritual form, which has to be done properly. And you sort of contain it and express it in that form. So the book of Leviticus, which we're about to get to soon in the Bible, has these rules. You got this kind of an animal and you have to bring it this way, and it's slaughtered this way, and it's cut this way, and it's cooked this way, and it's eaten this way, and it's very, very careful. And the analogy that I gave last time was an analogy to other human art forms which take the powerful emotions of human existence and express them in very carefully articulated forms, like ballet. You take all of the pain and love and anguish and tragedy of love, and you put it into a ballet. And ballet has to be done right. You can't just do what you want in ballet, right? You got to stand in a certain way and move in a certain way and express yourself in a certain way. And within that form, the form becomes the container for all that emotion. Right? Within that form, in the sonnet, in a certain way that you write a certain kind of formal poetry, right? In the East, there's this Japanese tea ceremony, which has to be done just properly, just right. You can't just serve the tea. It's got to be done right because you're containing all that. Now, here's the sort of quick history of Jewish worship. So in the beginning there is spontaneous prayer, and in the beginning there is carefully articulated sacrifice. Moses is going to build the Mishkan. Moses is going to build this whole worship site. Come on, we got room? We got any room? I never. People should be stuck outside. Mickey, come in. We'll get you in here. Who else is outside? We got room over here. Mickey, we got room. Reba, come in. Come inside. Come inside. You people are precious to me, damn it. How many times do I have to tell you? Come, we got space. We got space. Come in, come inside. You can see me. There's nothing much to see. Listen, believe me. Evelyn, come inside. You want to come inside? Maish, come inside. We're trying to build a new synagogue. If one of you rich people will give me the $5 million, I'll have seats for everybody. How's that for an appeal? We're building a new synagogue. We are building a new synagogue. I just need another $17 million. Right. That's the world's greatest appeal for funds, Ladies and gentlemen, the good news is we have all the resources we need to achieve our goals. The bad news is it's still in your wallet. So let's see what we can do about that. Thank you. That's better. Good, that's better. All right. So where were we? You have spontaneous prayer. Moses builds this Mishkan. It's the Ark of the Covenant. It's this gold box with these two angels on top. It's the one that Harrison Ford found in a movie. That's the one. He builds that. He builds these tents that go around it. He builds altars and menorahs and stuff that go in front of it. And that goes with the Israelites in the desert. We arrive in Canaan. They don't know what to do with this thing. It worked in the desert. What do you do when you move into a new house and you have all this stuff from the old? So they put it in somebody's garage. Literally, there's a threshing floor. They put it in some guy's barn. And it sits there for 200 years until somebody can figure out what to do with it. Right? Then King David, captures Jerusalem, makes it his capital, and he brings the Ark of the Covenant and the tent up to Jerusalem, and he plants it across the street from the palace. And now when you go to pay your obeisance to God, you have to pay your taxes to the king. Brilliant move. And King Solomon, who's his successor, builds the first temple. He builds the first house of God. And the idea that God is going to move from a tent into a building is a very controversial thing if you stop and sort of think about that a little bit, because a tent represents something. It represents a certain world. And a building represents something very different. Very, very different. The idea that you can actually contain God in a building. He builds this. Actually, Solomon doesn't build it. He hires a contractor named Hiram. And Hiram builds it, right? That's how Jews do things, right? So Hiram builds it. It's a cedar, it's a wood building. And it stands on that site, on the top of the Temple Mount, until it gets sacked twice, and then the Babylonians come in 586 and they destroy it. They burn it. And the Israelites go into exile for a generation. They come back. Ezra rebuilds it. That's called the Second Temple, 444 BCE. It gets rebuilt, and it's a small stone building. The Greeks capture it in 166. The Maccabees recapture it after the Maccabean War, and then comes a king named Herod. Herod is a interesting character. He was born of the only tribe ever forcibly converted to Judaism. The Idumeans are the only tribe in the world ever forced to become Jewish, right? As opposed to those of us who were forced to go to Hebrew school, but this is different. And Herod comes back, and Herod becomes a sycophant to the Caesar Augustus, and he is a complete lunatic. He is a megalomaniac. He's a murderous megalomaniac, and he only does one really good thing. He builds stuff. Like, be careful what contractor you hire, right? And all over Israel are building stuff. The whole city of Caesarea, the city of Beit Shan, beautiful cities. And he wants to remodel Jerusalem. And during his rule, he remodels Jerusalem. Now, the temple was a small building sitting on a small hill. He wanted to build a big building on a big hill. So he builds huge, giant retaining walls and fills in the fill and creates a huge platform where the Temple Mount used to be. The Kotel, the Western Wall, you know that place? That is not a wall of the temple. That was a retaining wall to the hill. So you ask yourself, why are we praying at a retaining wall? And I'll say, that's a damn good question. I don't know. Why would you do that? Right? Especially if you're female and aren't allowed to even pray there. Why would you want to pray there? What's holy about a wall? Right? Well, somebody said it was holy, so it's holy. Anyway, on the top of that platform, he paves that platform in white marble and builds the new temple. The new temple that Herod built was the most beautiful building in the world. It was so beautiful that tourists came from all over the world to see it. A beautiful cube of white marble, topped with a golden parapet, surrounded by a triple colonnade, 3 rows of white marble columns imported from Italy. And there were small gates that took you from the court of the nations into the court of the Israelites and into the holy precincts where only the Levites and priests were allowed. In the building, 2 rooms. The outer room was a room where worship was offered. The inner room was the inner sanctum, Kodesh HaKodashim. In the first temple, that's where the Ark of the Covenant was kept. In the second temple, the room was empty. And that's where God had his office. That's where God showed up in the world. That was the connection between heaven and earth. That was the place where heaven and earth kissed. And nobody ever went into that room except the high priest on Yom Kippur. And he would spend a whole month in meditation so that when he went into that room, he could fully concentrate on the welfare of his people. He would carry a censer full of incense so he couldn't see anything. It was full of smoke and incense. Wearing nothing but a linen gown, he would walk into that room and pray for the welfare of the people. But before he went into that room, they tied a rope around his ankle. Because if the poor schnook would drop dead in the middle of the ritual, nobody else would have to risk their lives going in there to schlep him out. And they could pull him out because God lived in that room. Now that temple was built at around the year 4. And in the year 70, the Romans, the Jews had begun a revolt against the Romans in 67. In the year 70, the Romans came and destroyed it. The Romans came and just took it down because the Romans needed to show the world what happens if you defy the emperor. They were very angry at the Jewish revolt for 2 reasons. One is because the Persian Empire was to the east of Palestine, of Israel. And if they lost Israel, if Israel stopped being a Roman colony, there'd be nothing to keep the Persian Empire from invading the eastern end of the empire. So they needed to maintain that as a Roman bulwark. And second of all, they didn't like Jews anyway. And they needed to make an example of this people. If you defy the emperor, this is what happened. So when the armies of Vespasian, the armies of the Romans, came to Jerusalem, they did something which pagan armies almost never did. They destroyed a temple. Pagan armies don't destroy temples. What they typically did is what Antiochus did, was put their gods in your temple. Because pagans are pluralists. Pagans are multicultural. Pagans are mellow. Only a monotheist will kill you for your religion. Pagans are, you daven by me, I'll daven by you, gesund. It's fine, it's good, you know. You pray your way, I pray my way, everything's fine. I put my gods in your temple, you put your gods in my temple. We can get along, you know. This monotheism, so typically pagans did not destroy temples because temples were considered holy in their own places. But this temple was seen by the Roman Empire as the source of the sedition. This was the center of the revolution, the revolt, and they had to make a political example of this temple, so they blew it up. It was built out of limestone faced with marble. Limestone is calcium carbonate. The way you destroy a building like that is you build a fire. As the rock gets hot, the gases inside the rock expand, and the thing explodes. The Jews saw the whole temple explode. Now, for just a moment, imagine what that looked like in that moment. Right? That moment, the holiest place in the Jewish world is destroyed. The place where God maintained a residence in the world is destroyed. The priests are murdered. The altars are desecrated. The menorah is stolen away. It's on that Arch of Titus in the Roman Forum. Everything that was sacred, everything that connected this people to their identity, to their past, everything that connected them to their God is gone. The Romans made Jerusalem off limits to the Jews. You couldn't, if you're a Jewish, you couldn't go to Jerusalem. They renamed Jerusalem Aeola Capitolina, dedicated it to the god Jupiter. They made the land of Israel someone else's country. You made it and pushed us out of our own home. So the tremendous trauma of this moment, the catastrophe of this moment. Now, here's what happens. The question is, what happens next? What happens to the remaining civilization? And you can imagine that there were three basic options in front of the Jews of that moment, the ones who survived the catastrophe. Option one is, if another nation conquers you and destroys your temple, it obviously means that their gods are real gods and your God is not. So become a Roman. And I'm sure there are a bunch of Jews who became Romans. They just defected from the whole process and just left the Jewish part. A second thing, there were ideologies that sort of explained it. One of them was a group of Jews who had gathered around a Galilean preacher who had been crucified a generation earlier. And he had sort of predicted this was going to come. And his followers said he was the Messiah, and the Jews rejected him, and this was punishment. They're called Christians. You may have heard of them. They did okay. They had a reason, they had a way of explaining this, you see? But if you didn't want to believe that Messiah came, because the world sure don't look messianic, and you didn't want to become a Roman, what was left to you? And that is the birth of Judaism. What you and I call Judaism is not in the Bible. The Bible is its constitution, as it were. The Bible is its basic principles. But the practice of what we call this religion, Judaism, is born in the shadow of that catastrophe. And the people who put it together are a new class of leaders called the rabbis. The rabbis did not exist before that destruction. Nobody's called rabbi before that destruction. The rabbis are a group of teachers who made a separate peace with the Romans, escaped from the city of Jerusalem, established an academy in the town of Yavne, which is a lovely little farming village not far from Tel Aviv, and set up shop. And when the refugees had witnessed all this trauma, they came to that small group of teachers and they said, what do we do now? What do we do now? Where do we go? How do we go on? How do we go on being Jewish? What does being Jewish mean? We have no temple, we have no priests, we have no sacrifices, we have no city, we have no land, we have no state, we have nothing. And the most bitter question they must have asked, those remaining teachers, is a good question of post-Holocaust Judaism. Does God hate us? Has God rejected us? Is this the end of the covenant? Because what kind of God lets his house be destroyed? What kind of God lets his city be destroyed? What kind of God allows his people to be tortured this way? Does God hate us? And you could imagine that the rabbis who were in that moment could have said to them, yeah, this is the end. Pack it in. You could have done that. They could have said, no, let us maintain the traditional ways of our ancestors. If God defeated Pharaoh, God will soon defeat the Romans. And they could wait for the new 10 plagues to come. And they would have waited and waited and waited. It would have lasted a generation, one generation. The second generation would have said, to hell with this, and we would have been gone in a generation. They didn't do either one of those things. They did something quite remarkable. They gathered in all the extant traditions, all of the groups, and they said, let us amalgamate all of the perspectives, all of the groups, and let us create something new. Now, they didn't call it something new, because if you call it new, it's not kosher. What you want to do is, let's preserve what we have. And they created what we call Judaism. That's where Judaism is born at that moment. At that moment, Judaism is born. Right? And we've talked about this before. The statement, I think, that was uttered is a statement that we find in a small book. 150 years later, they're going to write down books of their traditions. They're going to gather in the traditions that they created in the wake of the catastrophe, and they're going to write them down. One of those books is called, that book is called the Mishnah. Mishnah means the second Torah. That's the book you need next to your Torah. And in that book, there's one book that doesn't have any law in it. It's called Pirkei Avot, Ethics of the Fathers, or Wisdom of the Ancestors. And I suggest to you that Pirkei Avot is a handbook on how do you rebuild a religious culture after a catastrophe. And what you have there is that guidebook. And in the first chapter of Pirkei Avot, there's this remarkable statement. It says, Al shlosha dvarim ha'olam omed, ala Torah ve'al avah ve'al gemilut chasadim. That was the answer. On three things the world stands. On Torah, on prayer, and on acts of kindness. Now, two statements. Statement one, the world stands. This was a generation who saw everything dear to them destroyed, everything precious to them taken away, exiled from all of the sources of their sacred. They saw their world come apart. And frankly, it's more than just a metaphor, because at the center of the Holy Temple was a large piece of limestone called Even HaShtiyah, the foundation stone of the universe. That's the stone that Abraham was traditionally supposed to have sacrificed Isaac. That's a stone that was considered holy long before Jews existed in the world. That stone was the foundation stone of the universe. Right? That stone, when they saw the temple explode, they assumed that stone exploded with it. So for them, the world was, as it were, literally knocked off its axis. Now, by the way, the stone survived. And today, it's under that very attractive golden dome that the Muslim world has donated, right? It's called the Dome of the Azoi. That's the rock. It's still there, right? How do we know if it's still there? Because I just told you that. You can go and touch it. Now, how do you know that's the rock? If you're willing to pray at a retaining wall, you'll believe me when I tell you that's the rock. And by the way, Bobby, if you'd like to see a beautiful golden dome over Valley Beth Shalom, for a small fee, we'll name it for you. We'll call it Bobby's Dome. We'll call it for enough money. We'll call it for. I have no pride anymore. I got to get this place built. I'll call it. The FedEx Synagogue. I have. Microsoft Shul. You pick the name. I have no problem. What? Talk to Gates. Right? No, Alavai. Talk to Gates. Yeah. It would solve a lot of my problems. They saw the temple, they saw the rock. They really thought their world was knocked off its axis. And their world, metaphorically, was knocked off its axis because everything that connected them to each other and to their culture was gone. They go to this rabbi. The rabbi's name was Shimon Bar Yochai. He's the first rabbi. And that title, rabbi, is only used then with him. He's the first one. Because rabbi means that the whole community, regardless of your politics, regardless of your religious inclinations, now we recognize him as one of the masters of this tradition. And they say to him, what do we do? And he says to them, the world stands. You didn't lose a God. You didn't lose a world. You lost a building in Jerusalem. That's all. Just a building. In fact, it's better than that. He actually had a more interesting idea. There's a prophet named Ezekiel, who was a prophet when the first temple was destroyed in 586. He was a prophet in Babylon. And they came to Yechezkel and they asked him this question, Ayem kom kvodo, where does God live now that the temple's been destroyed? And Ezekiel answered a great thing. He said, Kvodo malei olam. God's glory fills the world. The rabbis offered this idea. It's not that God lived in that room in Jerusalem, and now that that room is destroyed, God has left the world. On the opposite, God was trapped in that room in Jerusalem, and now we've liberated God. We've liberated God. And because we liberated God from that room, God's glory can fill the world. And the reason why you can't find God is not because God is metaphysically far away. God has not been exiled from the world. The reason you can't find God is you're looking for love in all the wrong places. I'm going to teach you to find God in all the places of your life. First of all, you need to know that the new pillars of Jewish life are going to be Torah, the learning of scripture, of narrative, and we're going to build schools. The school, Beit Midrash, now becomes the central institution of Jewish life. You don't need sacrifices anymore. We replace them with verbal prayer, and we'll build synagogues all over in order to worship God. And third, Gimilut Chesed, acts of kindness, will be taught to you where? Where do you learn acts of kindness? At home. And the rabbis promulgate for the very first time an ideology of the Jewish home. You don't find the home in the Bible. The Bible's all about, like the temple sacrifices. You don't find the home in the Bible. The Bible's about kings and priests, and you don't find the home in the Bible. It's the rabbis of the Talmud, of the later tradition, that promulgated the idea of the home as a place of the sacred. Now, temple is in Jerusalem. Sacrifices are in Jerusalem. Priests are in Jerusalem. School, synagogue, and home can be on Densmore and Ventura. Densmore and Ventura did not become holy because Harold Schulweis saw the Spirit of God one morning. He would deny that. Densmore and Ventura is holy because we come together to learn, to pray, and to practice kindness. That's what makes it now a holy place. This idea that God can be accessed any place through temple, through Torah, prayer, and acts of kindness now becomes the ideology, the foundation, the new foundation stone of a new Judaism, a new religion. Now, let's go back to what we said a moment ago. If God is everywhere, the problem, your sense of alienation from God is not metaphysical, it's psychological. It's not that God is so far away you can't get to him. It's that you don't see him right in front of you. So the rabbi said, I'm going to teach you a mantra. Well, they didn't use the word mantra, but you get the idea. I'm going to teach you a formula that's going to make you mindful of the presence of divinity in all the moments of your life. Here's the mantra. Ready? Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, and then whatever you happen to be doing at the moment. Yeah, if I'm eating bread, hamotzi lechem min haaretz. If I'm eating an apple, borei pri ha'etz. If I'm holding my child, shechianu v'kimanu v'gianu lazman hazeh. If I'm lighting candles, lahadlik ner shel Shabbos. What does that mean? Baruch atah Adonai. Baruch, we always translate it as praised. It's good, that's fine. There's a better meaning. It comes from the word berach. Berach means knee. The verb for berach is I kneel. Now, when do you kneel in front of somebody? You guys married? You're going to be kneeling soon. And then for the rest of your... No, I'm not going to... You kneel in front of somebody whom you acknowledge is of utter uncompromised importance to you. I kneel in front of the woman I married because I want her to know that she's now the center of my life. I kneel in front... The other time I kneeled is when my kids were born. They told us to baby-proof the house. And the way that you baby-proof a house, according to Parents Magazine, which is the Talmud of parenting, is you get on the floor and stick your tongue into everything. You learn after a couple of tries what not to. But that's basically, you get on the floor, literally, you kneel down on the floor and you crawl around and you see what you can get into trouble with. And everything gets blocked, gated, pushed away. You kneel because you say, this child is so important to me. I want to make sure that everything is safe for him. And you kneel before God because you say, I acknowledge that I am part of something so much bigger than myself. Baruch atah, I kneel before you. I acknowledge atah, not et. Not as if it were, et me would mean something, the direct object of the sentence, an object. But atah is you, it's personal. Baruch atah, I acknowledge you, Adonai, source of all being, Eloheinu melech haolam, who is present in all space and time, hamotzi lechem min haaretz, but who is revealed to me in this bagel. Amen. Or revealed to me in this apple, or revealed to me in this moment. The bracha that the rabbis created was an answer to the question, now that the temple has been destroyed, where is God? Has God abandoned us? Is God too far away? And the answer is no. Right here, if you're mindful, if you're aware. That's how the rabbis answered that question. The traditions of prayer in Judaism were a response to that catastrophe. Their response to that catastrophe. Now here's the problem. Be right with you. There was one problem. So here's the problem. The rabbis now are going to take the two biblical traditions of spontaneous personal prayer and organized, articulated, traditional sacrifice and marry them together. And they're going to create what we affectionately call services. Okay? Services. Now what is a service? You take prayer and you organize it, set a bunch of rules about it, and make it the communal collective way of worship. The question is, does that work? Because these are two very different things. What I say, the expression of my heart, is my own. It's personal, it's spontaneous, it comes from deep inside, it's filled with all my emotions. Stuff that's rule-bound has a very different structure. Put it the other side. When I bring a sacrifice, there's a thing there, an animal, a basket of food. When I'm bringing prayer, I'm bringing words. It's my wife's birthday. If I went to my wife and I say, honey, happy birthday, I'm so happy for you. I didn't bring you anything because, dear, nothing can capture my love for you. So we're not going out. I didn't buy you a present. I'm not putting on a suit. I didn't buy you flowers. I'm just telling you I love you with all my heart. 50-50 chance I'll survive, If I go to her and I say, I bought you these diamond earrings, it's better if I give them with a full heart, but at least they're diamond earrings on the table. And sometimes it takes the diamond earrings to sort of generate the sense of devotion. And that's the difference in the structure of a sacrifice and the structure of prayer. You see, prayer is just a speech act. So for it to have any efficacy, any realness to it, it has to carry an internal turn of the heart. It has to express something within. We call that in Hebrew kavanah, intention, feeling. Prayer is the only commandment in the Jewish religion that you have to have feeling for. Right? You give tzedakah, you give charity. I know you give charity because I know that you're generous people. You give charity. Now, it's better if you give charity with a full heart. It's better if you give charity. It's a better mitzvah if you give it with a full heart. But if you don't feel like it, that poor guy is hungry anyway. Give the charity. I don't care if you don't feel like it. You're not feeling like it doesn't compromise the fact that he needs dinner. So you give him the charity, whether you like it or not. That's the difference between tzedakah and charity. Charity, from the word kor, meaning heart, is an act that is valued only because it carries the heart. But in Judaism, tzedakah is an obligation whether or not you feel like it. Because the hungry person, the homeless person, the sick person still needs your help, whether you're in the mood or not. Remember Fiddler on the Roof? Reb Moshe, give me a kopek. He said, last week, here's a kopek. Last week you gave me a ruble. He said, I had a bad week. So you had a bad week, I should suffer? I mean, there's something to that, really. There's something. That's what you need to be giving. But you see, if you go visit a sick person, you should go with a good heart. But even if you don't, go. You fulfill a mitzvah, a commandment, whether or not you feel like it. If you feel like it, it's a better commandment, but it's still commanded. But prayer is the only one that if you don't feel like it, you don't do it. Because it's all feeling. It's just a speech act. It's all feeling. You see? So here's what's going to happen. I spent the whole time now explaining this. In combining the tradition of verbal prayer with the articulated rule-bound traditions of sacrifice, the rabbis created what we know as prayer, our way of devotion. The problem is, it's not clear that it works. So let's take a look. In the Mishnah, which is the collection of the rabbis' wisdom that was collected 150 years after the destruction of the temple, they lay out the rules of prayer. So this is Mishnah Brachot, which are all the rules of prayer. We'll take a look together. Okay? It starts out with this interesting question. When may one recite the Shema in the evening? Stop a second. You got to appreciate the question, because they know this is the first one you're learning. The temple was a place. It was a place in space. It was a building on a hill in Jerusalem with a retaining wall. It was there. You went there. It's gone. The rabbis say, now we're going to build a new temple. Not in space, but in time. Not in space, but in time. The new site of holiness, the locus of holiness, is not going to be spatial, but temporal. Right? So, what time can I say the Shema? Now, you remember the Shema in the Hafta, the paragraph after the Shema, it says, B'shach b'chav kumecha. You say this when you lie down, you say this when you rise up. So what time is lying down and what time is rising up? What do you do? Right? So from the time the Kohanim going to eat their truma at the end of the first watch taught Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer is still living on temple time. And he remembers that in 3 o'clock in the afternoon, that's when the priests went in to have their lunch. So from lunchtime, priestly lunchtime, which is 3, until the end of the first watch, which is 7. That's when you say Shema. The sages said you can say it until midnight. You can say it until midnight. They have an easier way. If you miss it at 7, you can go on until midnight to say Shema. Rabbi Gamliel, who was the Nasi, who was the head of the community, said you can say it till sunrise. And then they tell a story about Rabbi Gamliel, which is a sweet story. So it happened that Rabbi Gamliel's sons came from a house of feasting. And they said to their father, we have not recited the Shema. And he said to him, if the sun hasn't risen, you're obligated to recite it. Now, it's strange that a law code will give you a little maisa, a little story. And the story is a funny story. It's not what you expect to read. You expect to read a story of holy men, holy women, walking the world ethereally, touching nothing, corrupting and polluting. And the very first Mishnah gives you a story about what? A bunch of frat boys stayed out all night drinking and carousing. And when they got home, their rabbi father was waiting for them. Right? And when he discovered that the car was all right, it wasn't smashed up, and there were no undressed young women in the back seat, he asked them, have you said Shema yet? And I don't know if these boys were even thinking about the Lord's presence in their lives. Right? And they say, no. And he says, good, say it now. But it's past midnight. Who cares? Say it now. I like the fact that the Talmud begins with a father of teenage boys. To me, it gives me some comfort that my kids aren't the only ones. But there's something else about Rabbi Gamliel. Rabbi Gamliel, you're going to discover this in a moment, is a man who is just obsessed with the presence of God in his life. And the notion that even after a night of feasting, that even if you're a teenage boy whose mind is not on the Lord's presence, especially when there are teenage girls in the neighborhood or the world, right, that you too have to attach yourself to the presence of God. That's Gamliel. And that's what all this is about, after all. Now, see what's going on here. Remember, I said before there are two traditions, the spontaneous, personal, emotional tradition of prayer and the fixed, rule-bound tradition of the sacrifices, and we're marrying them together. So Rabbi Gamliel is an example of a person who has a hard time marrying these two together, because once you get into the life of God, no rules can hold it. They've passed the time. They really don't have a right to say the prayer. But he says, say it anyway. Say it anyway. Why? Because it's too good. And already you hear the tension between the inner life of prayer and the outer life of prayer. The inner life of the prayer and the outer life of the rules. And there's going to be a difficult tension there. And then they go back and they say, what time in the morning can you do it? Right? And then they talk about what does it mean to say you get up and you go to the next one, because we're not a lot of time. Mishnah Brachot, chapter 2. One who is reading the Shema and the Torah, and it came time to recite the Shema, if he directed his heart, he's fulfilled his obligation, and if not, he hasn't fulfilled his obligation. This is Kavanah. Here's the story. Ready? You're driving down Santa Monica Boulevard. Could happen. And there's a big billboard. And it says, Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord God, the Lord is one. Could happen. Having read the billboard, or a bumper sticker on the car in front of you. That's what I think I should do. Bumper sticker. If you're reading it as a billboard or as a bumper sticker and it's time for the Shema reciting, have you fulfilled your obligation to say the Shema? You see, it's a crazy question, because if the Shema is supposed to be my personal deep soul attachment to the presence of God, how can you tell me I have to do it at certain times of the day? How can you legislate the structure of devotion? Can you legislate the structure of devotion? Or is the legislation cancel out the devotion? And the rabbis say you can legislate it as long as you bring intention to the act. You bring intention to the act, right? It's how do you legislate? If it's my wife's birthday and I really didn't want to bring her anything, so there's a rule that says do it anyway. You'll get married. You'll see this is very important. Trust me on this. I mean, it's just a bitter experience, You do, because what happens is you will develop the kavanah in the course of doing it. So the rabbis say, if it's not the speech act itself, it is the speech act plus the intention to do it. Because just having the speech act, it doesn't fulfill the obligation. You hear what's going on here? Right? There's a similar one, by the way, elsewhere in the Mishnah that asks this question. On Rosh Hashanah, you are obligated to hear the shofar being blown. Right? What if you turn on the radio on your way to shul and you hear it on the radio? Does that count? No. Im kivein libo. If you stop and you say, oh my God, that's the shofar, it's yontif. Yes. If you that's exactly right. Exactly right. If you can summon kavanah, so the notion is that speaking and hearing, autonomic speaking and autonomic hearing don't count, but if you add kavanah to the thing, if you add kavanah, that is kavanah is that intention, it becomes a giving act, right? A giving act, then it becomes. Right? Like one year we were snowed into our apartment in New York on my wife's birthday. And I couldn't take her out. I had reservations in a nice restaurant, but we were living in New York, and I couldn't get out of the damn apartment. Right? And there was no food in the apartment. So we made scrambled eggs for her birthday dinner. But we made scrambled eggs for birthday dinner with a great deal of kavanah. That counts. Pay attention. Okay? Diamond earrings are better. Later, I gave her the diamond earrings. But you see, that's the point, right? So they say, okay. So now these are all lawyers. Rabbis are like lawyers. I apologize to the lawyers in the room. So they want to know, okay, you have to have kavanah? Fine. How much? How much? How much? How do you measure kavanah? Well, you measure kavanah by what it would take to break it. Like you measure the strength of a bridge by what it would take to break it. How much kavanah? Well, you can break off saying the Shema at certain places and not other places, right? Okay? One who recites the Shema but doesn't make it audible has fulfilled his obligation. Rabbi Yossi says, nah, you got to hear it. Right? One who recites it but doesn't articulate every letter, have you fulfilled your obligation? And here's the one. Look at number 4. Workers can recite the Shema on the top of a tree or on top of a wall of stones, which they're not permitted to do for the Amidah. The Amidah prayer, which we'll get to in a minute, has a higher level of kavanah. So, if you are the window washer at the Empire State Building, and you are on the 101st floor of the Empire State Building, washing the windows, and it's Shema time. Standing up there, 101 floors over the streets of Manhattan, can you say the Shema? That's very good. Right? Right? If you are in Cirque du Soleil, and you are that guy in the yellow jumpsuit who's balanced the top 3 beach balls, that are on fire, and it's Shema time, can you say that? How much kavanah? Right? A groom is exempt from reciting Shema on the first night. No, come on. The rabbis are unabashed about things like this. It's wonderful, right? After the wedding, you go back to your chamber. Your wife puts on her Victoria's Secret's best. At that moment, it's a little hard to concentrate on the Lord's presence in the room, unless you go, oh my God, It is told of Rabbi Gamliel, who did recite the Shema on the first night that he got married. It doesn't say what his wife said. You're going to what? You're going to what now? Now you're going to minyan now? Get back in here, right? But then the wonderful thing is that in rabbinic literature, the students show up, right, at that moment. So here is Rabbi Gamliel and his wife, and they're in their bedchamber, and she's in her Victoria's Secret's best, and the rose petals are scattered throughout the room, and the lights are low, and Barry White is on the CD, can you feel the love? And the students show up, and he's saying the Shema, and the students show up for under the bed, and they say, didn't you teach us, our teacher, that a groom is exempt from reciting the Shema the first night? Right? Right? And he says, I will not remove myself from the kingdom of heaven for even an hour.
When did divorce take place?
Yeah, right. No, actually, his wife becomes a hero. His wife is named Isha Shalom. She is a great hero in rabbinic literature, actually.
She should be.
Yeah. And then if you're grieving, if you're mourning, you're not allowed to say the Shema. Now, you see, all of this is about kavanah, because you have to have kavanah. You see, you've got to do this. Instead of a physical sacrifice, what are you bringing now? You're bringing the intention, but it's much harder to bring the intention absent the physical sacrifice. Absent the physical sacrifice, the cultivation of intention now has to become something even higher. Now, when we move from the Shema, which functions like the Pledge of Allegiance, the Shema is my pledge of allegiance to God and my attachment to my people, my pledge of allegiance. When I move from that to the Amidah prayer, which is the second prayer in the service, the Amidah prayer really is the pouring out of my heart in front of God. The Amidah prayer really is the expression of my connection, my communion with the divine. That has a much higher level of kavanah required. It has a much higher level. So the rabbis teach, did I leave it off of here? The rabbis teach, I left it off, that one cannot say the Amidah except with koved rosh, with a tremendous amount of concentration. So there's a whole tradition of praying before you pray, but for pray, right? Because the idea is you can't enter into that communion with the divine unless you're really centered there. And then in the middle of the discussion of the laws of how you say this prayer, in the middle of that discussion, you get the following remarkable Mishnah. It's a remarkable statement from the rabbis who created our prayer traditions. Rabbi Gamliel taught every day one must recite the 18 benedictions. So the Amidah is made up of 18 benedictions, and Rabbi Gamliel, who is the formalist, says, you got to do them all. That's how you do it. You do it right. Remember the sacrifices? It has to be done right, and the rule is you do all 18. Rabbi Yoshua says you can pray in abbreviated form. The minimum daily adult requirement is an abbreviated form. If you can do the 18, do the 18, but if you can't, you're required to do the abbreviated form. In other words, it's more important that you find the kavanah, you find the connection with God, than you say the actual words. The words themselves, according to Rabbi Joshua, are not as important as the kavanah, as the sense of intention that one brings to it. Rabbi Akiva, who's the student of these two guys, finds a compromise. He says it depends upon the prayer. It depends upon how adept you are at the act of praying. If you're adept at the act of praying and you can get through all 18 blessings and maintain concentration through the 18 blessings, then do that. But if you can't, then say the abbreviated form. It's a question of how fluent you are in the mechanism of the thing. And then comes Rabbi Eliezer, who is no lightweight in the Talmud. I mean, he is a huge force in the Talmudic literature, and he blows away the whole discussion. The premise of the discussion is, we can legislate what prayers you say. We can legislate devotion. And Rabbi Eliezer comes along and says, boys, you can tell people to say the Shema, because that's the Pledge of Allegiance. And that requires a minimum amount of kavanah. But when you're talking about full-on soul communion with the divine, you can't tell people what to say. And he offers this opinion, which is just remarkable. Rabbi Eliezer says, one who makes his prayer fixed, keva, eino tachnunim. It's not prayer. Once you legislate it, it's not prayer. If you make a rule that on your wife's birthday you bring roses, if you bring roses, you've screwed it up. First of all, you can't tell people to feel a certain way. And more than that, once you legislate it and regularize it, then his act of bringing roses is no longer his act. He's just fulfilling the law. Rabbi Eliezer says, guys, this whole notion of formal services, it ain't going to work. Because what we want is people to find that place of deep personal communion with the divine. You can't tell them how to do it. You can't tell them when to do it. You can't tell them what to say. You've ruined it. From the very first, so for those of us who have trouble with prayer, which is like everybody, from the very beginning, there was a debate among the rabbis of, is this really going to work? And Rabbi Eliezer, who is no small guy, is huge guy, says, no, it doesn't work. You can't tell them what to say. Now, the Talmud, which is the subsequent rabbinic tradition, is going to try to amplify and define what Rabbi Eliezer meant. And there are three wonderful opinions. So this is Talmud Brachot. And they asked, remember, Rabbi Eliezer said, one who makes his prayer, and the word he uses, keva, which means fixed, regulated. What does he mean by that? I mean, what kind of prayer is he forbidding, right? Or is he objecting to? So the opinion is Rabbi Yosef Bar Idi and the name of Rabbi Yoshaya, who says, anyone whose prayer is like a heavy burden on him. Rabbi Shulweiss used to have this wonderful idea. He says, when he was a young kid, he used to watch his grandfather pray. He says, Orthodox, traditional, Hasidic, Bronx synagogue, late afternoon Yom Kippur, prayer is a burden. Right? He said, it's like a debt, and you have to pray off your debt. That was the phrase he used. And I got to tell you, sometimes it's like that. I'm telling you, Yom Kippur afternoon, it's like, oh, nebuch, it's like, And the rabbis are saying, that's, one of the metaphors they use, and it's not prurient, I think it's beautiful, is lovemaking. When lovemaking becomes a burden, don't do it, because it's not lovemaking anymore. Right? It's supposed to be an expression of our communion, and if prayer becomes something you got to do, it's mincha, mariv, got to do it, say, don't do it, it's a burden, don't do it, that's not right. It's got to be something that with all your heart you can't wait to do. Right? Number two, here's the second opinion, ready? Whoever doesn't say it in a manner of supplication. So if you show up and you just do it perfunctorily, just because it has to be done, or you're doing it because you're trying to get it out of the way, right? Or you're doing it, in any other way except that you're standing before the creator of the universe. Don't do it. Don't do it. And then the next one I think is the most remarkable, I think. Rabbah and Rav Yosef say, whoever is not able to add something new to it. If you approach God and you can't say something new, you're boring God. I mean, you all complain that services are boring. I got news for you. The most bored person in the room is the Lord. He's got to listen to all this. And if you have nothing new to say, God says to you, what's new? And you say, same old, same old. God says, fair. So what?
Trump is winning.
Trump is winning? I won't tell you what God says about that. I could tell you what the Pope says about that. And I didn't know the Pope was a voter in America. Who knew? I thought that was quite remarkable. So what I'm suggesting here, we'll finish in a few minutes here, is what you find in Mishnah Brachot is a reflection on this whole question about how Jews express devotion. And from the very beginning, the rabbis who created our prayer traditions had a lot of doubt about whether this was really going to work. Because they understood that a prayer tradition has to unite two very disparate things. The regular saying of communal collective worship and what's supposed to happen inside. The poetics of prayer, the deep feeling of prayer. And the rabbis weren't sure. Maybe that's not the right way to do it. Maybe that's not the right way it ought to be done. And then you find this all over the place in rabbinic literature. So here's one more, and I'll finish with this one and then in Maimonides. Rabbi Akiva, this is in Midrash Tanchuma, so this is a Midrash. The Midrash is about Chayei Sarah. And Chayei Sarah is about the death of mother Sarah, right? And at the end of the Chayei Sarah, it says, Abraham remarried and had another family. Kanai Nahara, the guy was 100 years old. He found a rather younger woman, and he had 12 children. Now you know why we pray, right? So here's what they say. Rabbi Akiva, when he prayed with the community, would pray according to custom, kedarka. But when he prayed by himself, he would start at one corner of a room and end up at the opposite corner because of his movements and bowing. What does that suggest? Well, first of all, he had two different prayer traditions. He recognized that as a leader of the community, he needed to participate in the collective religious life of the community. So when he was playing rabbi, he would stand still and pray like everybody else. But when he was by himself, he danced. He danced. And the idea, it's interesting, by the way, I don't know if you know this, but we have bodies. You wouldn't know that, by the way, from our prayer tradition. Because we say, come to synagogue and sit in that chair for 3.5 hours. And we sit, we like Jews have forgotten over the last 2,000 years that we actually have bodies. Like it's all cerebral, it's all head, it's all about learning Torah and praying. This it goes up to here, you pray from here. The idea that you have bodies, right? You have a body, and that prayer should be an expression not only of the head, but of the whole self. And Rabbi Akiva had this idea that when he was by himself, when no one was watching him, he danced his prayer. That's this remarkable idea. Now, we Jews, we're all, you're all a bunch of, repressed suburban people. You just stand there very quietly. We can't even, I try to get people to laugh a little bit in shul. Even that's hard, much less express, get up and move, damn it. You ever been to a black church? Yeah. They don't sit still. They don't sit, they're up moving. And boy, can they move, can I know? We would move too if we were. Let's move. I mean, get up and move, damn it. If you are filled with the glory of God, why are you sitting your tuchas in a chair? Amen. So can I get an amen about that? Amen. There you go. Yes, sister.
Maybe the Hasidim had that.
The Hasidim, see, again, so I was going to get, next time we'll do Hasid, not next time we're going to do the Golden Calf, but 2 weeks from now we're going to do Hasidism. Hasidism comes along. Hasidism wasn't alone. Hasidism was a religious mystical movement of the 18th century. But what happens is because of these tensions that are built into the devotional tradition, the tension between inside and outside, the tension between the rules and the heart, the tensions within prayer, you have these explosions at certain points of Jewish history when people said, let's do it a different way. And Hasidism was one of the most famous ones. Now, you all look at a chassid and you see a fella in a long black coat and a long black beard and a big furry hat, and he talks, in a Brooklyn accent and tells you that the way he prays is the way we always prayed. He's a revolutionary. But if you're in a tradition that values the past, the way that you do a revolution is to bury a revolution in the past. And you make your revolution something amazingly new, but you claim that it was always that way. Hasidism and many other mystical pietist moments in Jewish life resolved this, renegotiated this contract, and tried to create a more expressive, more emotional, more physical expression of worship, because they realized that the rules can bury the heart. And that's where you get an explosion of Hasidism. Where Hasidism, you all know Hasidism. Hasidism creates a thing called the nigun, which means no words, prayer without words. Right? I want to try this one day. If I try this on Yom Kippur, will somebody not get me fired? Right? I want you to close the prayer books. I want to pray for the next hour without a book in front of you. I think that there's enough in your heart, enough regret, enough shame, enough guilt, enough hope, enough aspiration, enough soul to pray for 1 hour without somebody telling you what words you're supposed to use.
I'll take your job when they fire you.
There you go. So nice to have a friend. I got a call from Stuart Ainut, the Jewish press in New York, that the conservative movement, my rabbinical organization, just published a new prayer book, right? I said, Stuart, I don't have it. He said, have you seen it? What's your reaction to it? I said, let me ask you just one question. I said, sure, what's the question? How long is it? So he looked at it, he said, 828 pages. I said, I rest my case. Like what? It's called, by the way, it's got a beautiful name. It's called Don't Drop This on Your Foot. It's like Jewish verbal diarrhea. I mean, what do you need this? Like, close the book. So the Hasidim come along and they say, close the book and just pray. Because it was always a question of, how do I express my devotion? Now, it goes both ways. I want to be very clear about this. On the one hand, it's don't let the rules destroy the work of the heart. But it goes the other way as well. The heart needs to be encouraged. The heart needs to be inspired. Right? I don't say this, I should turn off the machine. I don't always feel like expressing my love for my wife. Because we're married. And that's what marriage is. But when her birthday comes along, it inspires me to go back and review the moments that we've shared, and it gives me a structure in which I return to that level of devotion. The structure is necessary so that the heart doesn't become solipsistic, all concerned about itself. You need structure and you need intention, but the question is, what's the transaction between the two? I'm going to finish with one statement, and then we're going to help our friend. Maimonides, who's going to come along 1,000 years later, is going to say something quite remarkable. He says, look at the second thing on Maimonides. Anyone who serves God out of love and occupies himself with Torah and mitzvot, follows the ways of wisdom, should not do so for any other reason or out of fear of curses or to receive blessings, but should fulfill the truth because it's truth. He says, look, prayer has to come from the heart. And then he says, it's out of love. You have two choices in religion. You do it out of fear, or you do it out of love. It's one or the other. Fear means, bless me, God. And love is, I'm coming to bless you, God. And then he says, what's love? And this is the most extraordinary statement, because there was never a Jew who was tighter with his emotions than Maimonides. There's never a Jew who was more controlled, colder, more analytical, more mathematical than Maimonides. And he writes this. He says, you're supposed to love God. You're supposed to come to God out of love. You shall love the Lord your God, right? What's love? What is appropriate love? This is number 3. This is an extremely strong and profound love of God, so that one's soul is committed to the love of God, and that one will be so preoccupied with it that one will appear to be lovesick, in which one's mind is perpetually occupied at all times with a particular woman. Apart from this, one's love of God has to be absolute and continuous, as we're commanded with all your heart and soul. Solomon said this by way, I'm sick with love. The entire Song of Songs is exemplary of the concept. He says, you're supposed to get so far into God, the way that a crazy young man gets far into the woman that he loves. And that's from the most controlled guy in the world. That's the problem then. So the question is, how do you express that kind of love in a formal, communal, shared expression of services? And that's the great paradox of devotion in the Jewish faith. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to take a break next week, and we're going to read the golden calf story. And then the following week, we have 2 more Torah portions on this section. We're going to come back and try to answer that question by looking at the way that the Kabbalah, the mystical tradition, and then the Hasidic tradition answered that question. Okay?